Welcome, everyone. So happy to be learning together again today. This class is the Postmodern Piety of Rav Shagar with Rabbi Zachary Trubov. Just a reminder, please keep yourself muted during class when you're not speaking, but then feel free to unmute anytime you want to ask questions or make comments. You can ask them freely. If you once you join in the webinar, you'll be getting an invitation from me to become a panelist. That would allow you, accepting the invitation would allow you to participate verbally during class if you wish. Yeah, with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Trubov.
Thank you so much, Evie. I want to welcome everyone to what is our fifth session on the postmodern piety of Rav Shagar. Today's class is going to be on the problem of suffering. And in many ways, it's not so much that we're dedicating just this class to look at this. We've been actually looking at this issue from the very beginning of the course. And of course, one class alone would not be sufficient to even begin to fully address the problem of suffering. The problem of suffering is that which plagues not just religious life, but life in general. And if there's a, hard question to human existence, it may very well be this. What I want to try to do, though, in today's class is I'll begin by sort of reviewing a little bit about where we've been, and then trying to focus in on how Rav Shagar understands the problem of suffering, not why it happens. I mean, that's not something we have an answer for, but at the very least, to be able to grapple with what do we do with it, right? What do we do when suffering comes and tears apart our lives? I see Batsheva has a hand raised. Did you have a question, Batsheva?
Let me see. Oh, Batsheva, I can promote you to a panelist. Yeah. Batsheva, do you have a question, or was that just an accidental? I think we're good. We're good to continue.
Okay. We'll keep going. So let me mention where we've been and how we're leading up to where we are right now. So at the very first shiur together, we focused on the idea that Rav Shagar's whole world begins with the trauma of the Yom Kippur War. That the trauma of his experience in the Yom Kippur War, fighting in the war, is something that totally tears apart his world. And what I mean by this is that he is in a tank that is sent to the Battle of Nafach in the Golan Heights. As soon as his tank enters the battle, it is hit by a rocket, by Syrian rockets. He manages to throw himself free of the tank, but his two close friends, Shaya and Shmuel, are both killed. Rav Shagar is left grievously injured. He ends up getting off the battlefield, being rescued, and he goes to Maimonides Hospital to recover for a few months. Scars up and down his arms from his burns. This whole episode leaves a profound impact in Rav Shagar's life because his experience of trauma, his experience of suffering, puts him in a place in which he starts raising questions about everything. And as we saw with Rabbi Nachman, the questions that suffering raises are always questions without answers. Rabbi Nachman famously says that there are questions that come from the void that is a place absent of God, a void that is necessary for creation, but a void which is a place that is absent of God. And the questions that come from there are the questions without answers. Rav Shagar's whole goal in the aftermath of the war is to try to think through faith in redemption, faith in God, faith in the Jewish people, in a way that can make a space for trauma, for the way that trauma fundamentally interrupts the sort of happy ending that religion promises, right? Religion, if there's a story that religion tells, then it's not just Judaism. This is the story that pretty much all religions tell, right? It begins with Bereshit bara Elokim, right? Then the beginning of the world was created, but the end story of religion is always that they lived happily ever after, right? That's the way religion works. And Rav Shagar is noting very profoundly that the problem of suffering, the problem of trauma is such that ending of they live happily ever after doesn't quite make sense so much anymore. And we saw how he tries to grapple with this in a variety of ways. What I want to begin tonight is with a little bit of Rav Shagar's reflections on the Shoah, right? If you're going to talk about the problem of suffering, right? You cannot look away from the Shoah, from the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was very, very central for Rav Shagar for the simple reason that his parents were Holocaust survivors. Both of his parents, they're both Hungarian Jews. They both were Holocaust survivors. And Rav Shagar is very open about the fact, and he writes about this very openly, that as a second generation Holocaust survivor, he felt their trauma as if it was his own, right? He's very much aware when he's writing this. And I don't know if there's any second generation Holocaust survivors in the Shiur today, but second generation Holocaust survivors feel the trauma of their parents, even if they weren't there, even if their parents don't ever talk about their experiences, right? This is one of the fascinating things Rav Shagar is going to mention. His parents never spoke about the Shoah. Yet it was almost as if because of their silence, the Shoah was even that much more present in his home. So Rav Shagar spent a lot of time thinking about the Shoah. He felt it. He saw how it left a mark, a remnant on his parents after the war. They were never quite the same, he felt, because of it. So it was an issue that for him was worthy of attention and worthy of reflection. Not because there are going to be answers, but because, again, it has to be something that we can even begin to bring into a religious framework. So let's look at how he is sort of grappling with it. And the section we'll look at here is about this notion of silence, of muteness, right? This inability to speak about the Shoah. So here's what Rav Shagar says. He says, when tragedies occur in the world of believers, they often tend to ask, what does this mean? Right? That's what you do as a religious person, right? Whether you're a Jew or not, something bad happens and you ask yourself, what does this mean? Now, it's important. Rav Shagar isn't saying that the question is, why does this happen? Though that is a natural religious question that gets raised. Even if you don't ask, why does something happen? If you're a religious person at all, an authentically religious person in the right possible way, then you're going to ask, what's the meaning of it? What am I supposed to learn from this? And the problem with the Holocaust is not why did this happen, right? We're generally okay with being willing to acknowledge that certain tragedies, horrors are such that we can't answer why, but we still want to know what they mean. We still want to learn something from it. And Rav Shagar's point is that there's a way in which the Holocaust negates the very question of meaning. And that is exactly why it also thwarts our ability to speak about it, and why it thwarts the ability of survivors to speak about their experiences. He says the Holocaust negates questions of this kind, meaning the Holocaust is the kind of thing where you don't get to answer, what does it mean? He says, because it is a breaking of the world and its cultural structure. It is outside the boundary of the constructive world, outside the boundary of discourse, right? Language cannot grasp the Holocaust and make sense of it. And because of that, and this was true for so many survivors, right, they cannot talk about what happened. And in many ways, the horror, the trauma of the Holocaust is a double trauma. It's the trauma of what happened, and it's the double trauma of not being able to talk about what happened forever afterwards. And this is where Rav Shagar sees his parents trapped, and it's something that deeply, deeply upsets him. He says, this is how I experienced the meaning of the Holocaust, if I may say so, with my late parents. The Holocaust that ruined their youth, they carried with them for the rest of their lives. They never said anything about that period of time, meaning the very fact of their silence is that which proves how present it was for them, right? It was with them forever afterwards. And he says it ruined their youth. There's a sense Rav Shagar writes about, I mean, it's not exactly in these excerpts, but he basically is open about the fact that he feels that the Holocaust broke his parents, right? That there was something forever afterwards. I mean, he obviously didn't know them beforehand, but in his own experience with them growing up, there was something about them afterwards that he felt they had lost, right? Something of them had been broken, something of them had been lost because of what they went through. He says they lived their lives with a stubborn silence amidst the hiddenness of that which cannot be repaired. Meaning he's saying they couldn't talk about what happened, and that was almost as if an attempt to hide or repress the trauma that itself couldn't be repaired. He says, in fact, they were victims all their lives. They could not speak because the Holocaust left them speechless and they never recovered. They lived with a sense of distrust in reality and in people, which resulted in a lack of ability to accept others, to brighten their faces. It's a rabbinic expression, but basically ha'ir panim means to look at someone and see the light of their face, to be able to exhibit the light of your own face. And to feel the sense of well-being. This is a verse here: a man under our vine and under his fig tree. In a sense, continue to carry this burden. So what he's saying here is there's something about his parents in which they not only were they never the same afterwards, they were never able to be in real relationship with the world and with other people. There was always a sense in which everything could fall apart, both in their own lives and in their relationship to others. And they just couldn't be comfortable in their own skin. And there was always a profound fear of what was going to come. And again, if you're the child of Holocaust survivors, if you know Holocaust survivors, this is very typical, this sort of anxiety and depression and trauma that they carry with them that impacts their relationship to just about everything. Now, another interesting point I'll just note here, and this was something it took me a long time to really understand. There are no Holocaust survivors in my family. We had a lot of family that was killed in the Holocaust, but they did not. The ones who survived were the ones who were already in America. I grew up sort of assuming most Holocaust survivors talked about their experiences, because when you grow up, you hear Holocaust survivors talk, you just sort of get the sense, oh, this is something that is talked about, right? The people I know who are survivors, they're talking about it. They speak about it on Yom HaShoah. They speak about it to groups. It was only when I became a rabbi, a synagogue rabbi, and there were a lot of Holocaust survivors in my shul, that I actually realized how profoundly unusual it was for Holocaust survivors to actually talk about what happened to them. Most survivors would not talk about their experiences. And it wasn't because they lacked the courage, or it wasn't because they didn't want to. It was exactly because of what Rav Shagar is describing here, that there was something about it that broke the very framework of meaning in which they would have even tried to use language to make sense of it. And in many ways, it left them, trapped. Now, I don't want to say everybody who couldn't talk about their experiences was burdened that much more, but there are certainly many for which that was the case. Rav Shagar says here, he says this referring to this inability to talk about it, this muteness. He says, this reminds me of the Kabbalistic Hasidic interpretations of Passover and the Exodus from Egypt, according to which Pesach means Pesach, right? Pesach, the name of the holiday, the drush on it is that it can be broken into two words. Pesach, or the mouth that speaks. And that idea of the mouth that speaks is reflective of Pesach being a time of redemption. As he says, the coming out of speech from exiles. Dibor haya begalut, right? The speech was in exile, right? And the Exodus from Egypt is about speech returning to the Jewish people. That's what redemption is, to be able to talk, to be able to speak about those things that previously had been unspeakable. He says, usually speech is what turns a difficult traumatic event into human suffering that can be processed, right? Truly profound traumatic pain can't even be suffering until you talk about it, right? So there's something about suffering that is recognizable, that is able to be put into words, that's almost even cathartic, right? Trauma isn't going to necessarily go away, but to be able to speak about it at least turns it from this repressed pain that can overwhelm you into a human suffering that you can at least bring into reality, even if it's never going to in itself be fully wiped away. And as Rav Shagar says, when you can finally speak about it and bring it into language, even though it's still profoundly painful, this is the first step on the way to being redeemed from it. So again, we want to be able to bring speech to the problem of suffering, but what the Holocaust shows us is the way that suffering actually destroys our ability to speak, right? If the Jews in Egypt could not speak in the midst of their slavery, if when the slave master whipped the Jew, and the Jew's back is covered in gashes and bleeding and pain, right? The Jew cries out, but the Jew can't really speak about their pain. But the Exodus, right? How does the Exodus conclude? And we even do this in our Seders, right? When you cross the Red Sea at Kriyat Yam Suf, right? Not only do the Jewish people begin to speak, they actually sing, right? And that moment of singing is a way in which their experiences are finally fully brought into language. And that's why that's the moment of redemption. But the Holocaust does not have that moment. where speech returns or that speech is turned into song. For the Holocaust and for the survivors who went through it, it is ultimately a black hole that seems to suck everything inside of it. He says there's no conceptual system that can grasp the suffering at all. There's no words, again, that can make sense of it. In this respect, my parents remained in the Holocaust, a Holocaust that is not only murder, but is the murder of murder. Not injustice or suffering that occurs in a human context, but a deviation from it and its refutation. Right? And what Rav Shagar is getting at here when he calls the Holocaust the murder of murder, what he's saying is that murder fits within a normative framework. Right? If somebody murders another person, we can say that act is wrong. And if somebody murders 10 people, we can say that, that act is evil, that person is evil. But what happens when 6 million people get murdered in a way that we can't even wrap our minds around, right? In this systematic, dehumanizing, total fashion, when there's not just one person behind it, but there's a whole society of people behind it, right? You can't even use the word murder to describe what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust, right? That's why we had to invent this notion of genocide or crime against humanity, right? That's an attempt to say there's something worse than murder. But in truth, the problem of the Holocaust is that it can't be put into normative categories like murder. Again, if you can name something as evil, then it is no longer unspeakable. Right? It is no longer beyond language. And what makes the Holocaust so problematic is that we can't just call it evil and say, okay, we're done here, right? Evil doesn't fully grasp it. And I think we all know this, right? That is the very reason why language fails in the face of the Holocaust. He says the Holocaust is something that cannot be transformed conceptually into anything else and thus merits some recompense, meaning like, if we can't speak about it, if we can't bring it into language, then there's seemingly no way to elevate it in any fashion, or at least make it even minimally comprehensible, to turn it even from pain into suffering. He says, this is how I explain the silence of my parents who lived their lives in the same void that was opened up in the Holocaust. Auschwitz was the death of, hold on. Second. I apologize. 1 second. Auschwitz was the death of death. It is a death in which the possibility of mourning for what was lost also dies. It is impossible to carry out the work of mourning and get out of it and move on. So that same idea I was saying before, how we can't turn pain into suffering with the Holocaust, right? We can't actually engage in the work of mourning, which would allow one to process what they experienced and ultimately move forward. So again, this is a sort of a long-winded way of getting at the fact that true suffering, profound suffering, extreme suffering just destroys any sense of meaning that we may want to attach to it. And because we cannot speak about it, because we cannot make sense of it, it continues to haunt us in profound ways. Rav Shagar says, when I discuss the Holocaust, I do not do so from the perspective of one who's experienced it in the first person, but from the perspective of those who inherited it as an incurable disease, the hereditary disease of the second generation. It seems that in some respects, the members of the second generation are victims of the Holocaust, no less than the members of the first generation. I know that's a strong statement, but if I also know a lot of second generation Holocaust survivors, so I understand the truth of what he's getting at there. He says, for them too, the Holocaust demonstrates the absolute lack of confidence in existence, total loss of a sense that reality can be something you can depend on, right? Because at any moment, everything can collapse. An inability for it to establish itself, the constant threat due to the presence of a black hole that swallows everything in the backgrounds of their lives. For me, the Holocaust is that black hole of existing non-existence, a horror illuminated by the noonday sunlight, an atrocity that will nullify everything occurring in a world that continues to spin on its axis, existing non-existence. This is the reality that leads to being stuck without the ability to escape and without the ability to disappear. If you want to know what the endpoint of human suffering is, we don't have to imagine it. All we have to do is look at the Holocaust survivors and look at what they went through and look at what it did to them. If you want to know what suffering means, if you want to know what the end point is, when everything else has been taken away from the human individual, that is what it is. It is indescribable, and because language cannot grasp it, too often the case that survivors are stuck in the gravitational pull of the black hole of their trauma. And as Rav Shagar said, they're victims for the rest of their lives. And I think what's very important here is that Rav Shagar is noting that for some people, even for some who survived, there is no redemption for their pain. There is no redemption for their suffering. And that is a very, very difficult thing for us to grasp. I'll note that in the aftermath of World War II, after the establishment of the State of Israel, when Holocaust survivors came to Israel, it was profoundly difficult for Israeli society to fully welcome them and acknowledge what they had been through. It took, I don't know, at least another couple of decades before survivors were allowed to tell their stories here in Israel. And the reason for that, and this is important to understand, the reason that Israel and Zionism had such a profound difficulty, even like making a space for Holocaust survivors to speak, is because the whole Zionist narrative is one in which the Jewish people are taking power back for themselves. The Jewish people are regaining a sense of agency. And what that means is that Jewish people are not supposed to be victims. The Jewish people are supposed to be able to take their destiny in their own hands, take redemption into their own hands. And to confront the Holocaust survivors is to be reminded of the most profound example of Jewish victimhood. So basically, Israel and Zionism just said, we don't want to hear from you. We don't care what you have to say. We have a state. We're building a future here. And it was Zionism and it was Israel's inability to listen to survivors, again, that compounded the trauma in many ways for them, because the experience of being a survivor as described here is so counter to the Zionist narrative, religious or secular, even for, especially for secular Zionism, right? It was the Jewish people taking their power in their own hands and never going to be victims again. And suddenly the Holocaust survivors are showing up and reminding the Jews just how bad of victims they can fundamentally be. Now, if this is the extreme, if this is the, I said the end point of where suffering takes us, we also understand that it is not the only outcome. There's something very tragic about the way Rav Shagar describes his parents, and without judgment. I mean, he feels a sense of what has been profoundly lost for them. But as we also know, there are multiple responses, different reactions to people who go through something like this, without placing judgment on any particular path that people find themselves on. And to give an alternative that, again, reflects the same ideas, but also shows sort of a different direction one can go in, Rav Shagar turns to the example of the Klausenberger Rebbe. Klausenberg's in Hungary. He was a fairly, relatively young man during the World War II, during the Holocaust. The Klausenberger Rebbe lost everyone in the Holocaust. He lost his wife, he lost his parents, and he lost his 11 children. So coming out of the Holocaust, the Klausenberger Rebbe was profoundly aware of just how fundamentally traumatic the experience was. And what is very interesting about the Klausenberger Rebbe is that he writes about his experience in the camps. He basically writes some sort of, what you might call them memoirs about his experiences. And Rav Shagar points to them because he finds something very unique. When he looks at the Klausenberger Rebbe and sees somebody who has had everything taken away from them, and how is it that they choose to respond in the midst of that. So here's what he says. This is from the same essay as what we saw before, just a little farther on. He says, the decisiveness beyond God, the Rebbe of Klausenberg, he says, the great question that the Holocaust poses to the world in the end is not only directed to the human spirit, but also to religious belief. Does the Holocaust not disprove it? Not only man and his spirit died in the Holocaust, but it is claimed also faith in God. And we've talked about this, right? Trauma, if it erases meaning, then it is unquestionable that it is going to erase or challenge faith. If faith is, again, ultimately about some redemptive vision, where God makes everything right in the end, then the traumas of the Holocaust tell us, at least for those who experienced it firsthand, that there's just simply no way God can make that right. So obviously the Holocaust is a profound challenge of faith. And that is why Rav Shagar finds the Klausenberger Rebbe's response so significant. It is a profound and surprising religious reaction that I want to look at can be found in the biography of Rabbi Yekutiel Yehuda Halberstam of Sans Klausenberg. The Rebbe of Klausenberg was born in 1905 and grew up in the Hungarian occupation areas. In the Holocaust of Hungarian Jewry, he lost his mother, all his brothers and sisters, and his wife and 11 children. He himself went through a journey of hardship and suffering in concentration and labor camps and on death marches. During his path of suffering, he took it upon himself not to transgress the prohibitions of the Torah and not to eat anything forbidden, not even in the midst of the most dire situations. So what the Klausenberger Rebbe did is in the midst of the camps, in the midst of all these impossible situations, he basically said, I'm not going to violate the Torah. He said, no matter what, I am going to keep the Torah. Now, what you have to understand here is that we could look at this as, your classic tzaddik story, right? The story of a righteous, religious individual, a leader who is just willing to make these great sacrifices for Torah. And in many ways, that would be true, right? He goes on here to describe what did the Klausenberger Rebbe do? For example, in all 7 days of Passover, he abandoned his ration of bread, refused to eat any food cooked in the camp kitchen, and fed himself with a few potatoes that he cooked for himself in a dish he koshered before the holiday. Right? He's not going to eat chametz on Pesach. He's not going to eat any tray food. He's going to only eat potatoes. He's going to somehow manage to kosher a dish for Pesach. On the one hand, he made sure to live a full Jewish life. Pray, put on tefillin, say dach, a special Kabbalistic prayer every Shabbat with great intensity, and fiercely kept various customs, such as eating an apple on Rosh Hashanah. For this Jewishness, he was ready to give his life, right? At first glance, the story of the Klausenberger Rebbe in the Holocaust is a story of profound Kiddush Hashem. He's sanctifying God's name by sacrificing, doing whatever he can to keep God's Torah. But here's the problem, and it's something that Rav Shagar is deeply aware of, and I'm sure the Klausenberger Rebbe was aware of this as well. That, again, the Holocaust was a time of profound risk to everyone's life. And if you're familiar at all with halacha, with Jewish law, when human life is at stake, you basically can do just about whatever you need to do. You can't murder, you can't engage in sexual transgressions, and you can't worship idols, but everything else is permitted to save a life. And I'll point out that the halacha actually is that in times of pikuach nefesh, right, you are actually obligated to violate the Torah rather than risk your life to perform mitzvot. And this is where Rav Shagar, I think, finds the Klausenberger Rebbe so important. So Klausenberger Rebbe is doing this not because he feels that he has to, but because he feels that he wants to, that he must, not because God's commanding him, but because he believes it is something that is necessary for him to do. What do I mean by this? He says, his decision not to violate prohibitions did not stem from the thought that he is bound by Torah prohibitions, even in a situation when his life is in danger. And indeed, he instructed others. He would tell other people, it's pikuach nefesh, you got to eat chametz on Pesach. Don't try to put your tefillin on if the guard's going to catch you and you're going to be beaten, right? Since the hater now intends to eliminate the Jewish body as well, not only the Jewish soul, and does not give you any chance to avoid choice to escape from the sentence he has passed on you, we're commanded to do the opposite of his intention. This is not the time to avoid eating and risking our lives. I mean, the Klausenberger Rebbe would tell people that because the Nazis wanted to destroy the Jewish soul and the body, then by staying alive, the Jew is actually defying the Nazis. Right? That's exactly what Klausenberger Rebbe is saying is here. There's something religiously, spiritually valuable to staying alive, even if it means transgressing the Torah. He's telling other Jews, transgress the Torah, stay alive. That's what matters. But as for himself, he is adamant, right? He would say, Lord of the world, Ribono Shel Olam, I was left alone and destitute. Everything was taken from me. I was left naked and barefoot, and I'm still going to eat treifas? I don't want to eat treifas. I'm not eating them, right? This is what the Klausenberger Rebbe would say to God about himself, right? God, you can take everything away. I know deep down, again, the halacha says a person should violate the Torah so that they don't risk their life. But me, I'm not going to eat treifas no matter how much you think I'm supposed to, God. He says this decision does not exempt the Klausenberger Rebbe from suffering. He's not a tzaddik who in the midst of doing this, he's floating above the pain that's going on around him. He says from his history, this is not the image of a person who is not afraid and does not struggle and suffer. The Shekhinah was in exile. The Knesset Yisrael was in exile. And the Rebbe's fate was no different from them. However, although he knows his fears and weaknesses, he accepts them and is ready to impose his decisive decision on them. The Klausenberger's Rebbe's decision to keep Torah and mitzvos in the camps, even though he didn't have to, and maybe he shouldn't, was a profound religious decision and a very important one for Rav Shagar, because what it says is that even when everything is taken away, something still remains. And I want to explain what I mean by this. So Rav Shagar goes on, he says, in fact, in the Rebbe's stubborn decision not to question his faith and to devote himself to the observance of Torah and mitzvot, a decision that brought him many times to the point of death, his personal rebellion is expressed against his oppressor. However, in his faith and devotion to God, he establishes himself as free in the face of God who has betrayed him, so to speak, or in religious language, hid his face from him. Meaning, again, God doesn't require the Klausenberger Rebbe to not eat treifas, to not eat chametz, to do mitzvah. That's not what God wants. That's not what the Torah said for him to do. This is a decision he is making for himself. And he actually said, Rav Shagar says here, it is raised even above the divine command itself, right? Because he's not doing this because it's a mitzvah in the sort of narrow sense. In the dire situation of the Holocaust, the Rebbe of Klausenberg reveals that it is better for him not to live than to be dragged into a life without Judaism, without the mitzvot and the Holy Torah. Life is void of meaning for him. Meaning, if trauma strips everything away, maybe it doesn't. Maybe there is something that remains. Maybe the things that matter most to us always can remain, even in the midst of trauma. And that's what Klausenberger Rebbe is saying here. Even at a time where one could say the mitzvot don't apply, the mitzvot are still there. The mitzvot are in some sense still available to the Klausenberger Rebbe, right? They're not easy. They may be borderline impossible, but there's something about their reality that remains present for him. And he's not going to give up on them. He's not going to give up on them, even if God has maybe given up on him. He says, in his practice, he places the devotion to Judaism, the Jewish intimacy, and in fact, the holiness even begun God himself, who no longer commands them. You took everything from me, the Klausenberger Rebbe says, and I'm still going to eat treifas, and I'm not going to do that, God. Your Torah matters too much to me. Right? There's actually a line that Levinas writes an essay about the Holocaust, in which he titles it loving the Torah more than God. And there's something to that, because in the moments of profound suffering, all we experience is God's absence. But the Torah is still there for us. And there's a sense in these moments, and you see with the Klausenberger Rebbe, that his love for Torah and mitzvot almost exceeds his love for God, because in this moment, he can't necessarily love God, but the Torah and the mitzvot are still there for him. He says this decisive statement is not the product of halachic analysis, whether the Rebbe is obligated to surrender his soul at a time of religious persecution, etc., but it is a statement made in the face of the divine will that took everything from the Rebbe, even the commandment itself, right? God's commandment, the sense that God is the commander to whom we must submit because God is the higher power, right? That ends with the Shoah. But mitzvah does not end. The commandment that we have to be slaves to God, it no longer is comprehensible in the midst of the camps, but the mitzvah, the idea of mitzvah, the presence of mitzvah in our lives still remains. And this is something we have to understand very much, right? Again and again throughout Jewish history, the Jewish people have had this experience of everything being taken away, or so much being taken away from them, but there's always that which remains. And it would be my contention and Rav Shagar's contention, and we talked about this, that one of the things that always remains is the Torah, even after everything else. So after the Chorban Beis HaMikdash, after the destruction of the temple, right, the Jewish people turn their world to center around not a building, not sacrifices, but the words of the Torah. When Yochanan ben Zakkai sneaks out of Jerusalem during the siege, and he encounters Vespasian, and he basically interprets Vespasian's dream, and he tells him he's going to be, emperor. Vespasian offers to Yochanan ben Zakkai, like, whatever he's going to ask for. And Yochanan ben Zakkai, what is his famous answer? Yavna v'chochmecha. Right? In the moment of total destruction, Yochanan ben Zakkai asks for one thing, and that is for the Torah to be preserved. Because as I keep saying, when everything is taken away, there is always that which remains. And for the Jewish people, that's the Torah. because at the end of the day, you can't take the Torah away from the Jewish people, right? We are bound to it. It is bound to us, and it is bigger than words on paper. I'll give just another example of this. Hanania ben Shrajon, one of the great rabbis who was one of the martyrs during the time after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hanania ben Shrajon is punished along with the other martyrs. Each one sort of gets their own personalized punishment. Hanania ben Shrajon, for teaching Torah, is wrapped in a Sefer Torah and burned alive. So the Torah and he are to be consumed together. Rabbi Hanania ben Shrajon has a vision as he is perishing, as the Torah is being burned. His students ask him, what is it that you see? And Rabbi Hanania ben Shrajon says, the parchment burns, but the letters rise to heaven. Right? There is something about the letters and language and Torah and mitzvot that remain, that nobody can take away from us, because they're not a place, they're not a thing, they're not something substantial that you could point to, that if someone takes it away, it's gone forever, right? The power of words, the power of language is the way in which it is eternal, and the way in which, again, it can always remain. It can always be there for us. Not always in the sense that God is always fully present behind it. As I said, in the Holocaust, God is not there for people. That's very clear. But God's Torah remains, and the mitzvot remain, and the holiness that they bring to our lives remains. And even in moments of profound absence and destruction, right, there are things that are still there. Trauma can take away language, it can exceed language, but there are ways in which language remains, and language enables us to find meaning even in those moments. I want to give another example about this. That comes from Dr. Rachamim Melamed. This is from Rav Shagar. I don't know if people know who Dr. Rachamim Melamed is. He was a rabbi and a Jewish educator, Israeli. And about, I don't know, maybe in his 50s or 60s, he was diagnosed with ALS. ALS is a terrible disease. It's a progressive disease. And what makes ALS so tragic and so painful is that it takes everything away from a person, step by step by step, right? You basically lose muscle control over your whole body until the end, in which you have zero muscle control at all. And you're essentially, completely locked in, conscious, still aware, but no longer able to move or communicate in any way whatsoever. And again, it's sort of if we want to talk about the end point of suffering, this is what it is. Again, when everything is fundamentally taken away from you. So we're going to move to that. But as a preface, here's what Rav Shagar says. He says, let us take, for example, one who is told that they have cancer. May it never happen to us. Now, again, Rav Shagar writes this. He himself is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer about 2 years after he writes this. So again, there's something that is deeply prescient about what he is writing here. He says, the disease is, of course, a terrible thing, but as a result of his illness, he may discover in himself powers and processes that he was not aware of, and they will help him in his dealings with the illness. Perhaps in this cruel situation, he will be able to discover things about himself and his environment that would not have been revealed to him in his normal way of life. Now, we have to understand what Rav Shagar is saying here. He is not in any way denying the reality of the illness and the suffering that it brings. What he is simply noting is that sometimes we don't have a sense of what truly matters to us until so much of what we care about has been taken away. And this is a very fundamental point for the way that we relate to and understand suffering. If suffering is about taking the things away, then the question is what, as I keep saying, what remains? What is that's still there? And again, what happens with the suffering of a major illness is as much as it takes things away, it also helps reveal maybe things about yourself and others that are truly sublime. There's actually a quote by Franz Rosenzweig, great German Jewish philosopher. Franz Rosenzweig himself went through the same condition as Rachamim Melamed. Rosenzweig was diagnosed with ALS and died at about, age 45 or something like that. Rosenzweig spent the last, almost 15, 10, 12 years of his life essentially fully paralyzed, barely able to communicate. And he writes in one of his essays on the poems of Yehuda Levi, what Rosenzweig says is he says that every person has the right to deny that suffering is a divine gift. Well, now what does he mean, right? Suffering, divine gift. What he is saying here is as follows. What he means is that suffering, again, it doesn't have meaning. We don't understand why it happens. It comes to take things away. And because of that, it should not, it can't necessarily be fit within a religious or theological narrative. And anybody who's going to attempt to put suffering in a theological narrative is ultimately doing something that is fundamentally wrong. However, what Rav Rosenzweig also understands, and he also understands this from personal experience, and it's the same point that Rav Shagar is saying here, is that suffering is a gift only in the sense that because it takes things away, it also reveals that which remains. And that which remains after that which has been taken away from you is no longer there, is always something truly holy and sublime. And if there's a gift in suffering, it is that. But again, everyone has the right to say that they reject suffering entirely and that it's fundamentally meaningless. Because the fact that, again, suffering can reveal that which is important, still in any way cannot justify it for the horrors that it imposes on us. He says here, Rav Shagar, when a person is faced with death, at first it undermines his life, undermines his imagined security. It is possible that a person will not be able to get out of this predicament and will enter a mental state of depression. When you face death, when you face a diagnosis like cancer or ALS, right, again, it just pulls everything out from under you. It's as if there's a hole now under your feet and you are about to fall into it. He says maybe he'll try to recreate in his imagination the days of his youth, right? When you are threatened with everything being taken away from you, right? There's an inclination to turn back to those moments when you felt like you had that plenitude, when everything was good, right? You're going to turn back to your youth. He says, though, but if we take as an example a model like that of Dr. Rachamim Melamed, here we have an example of someone who passed this stage. Looking at the books and poems he has written in recent years, in which he has completely limited in his use of his body due to a severe degenerative disease, one can see that he expresses, with the minimum that is left of his life, the enormous vitality of life inherent in him. Rachamim Melamed, like Franz Rosenzweig before him, wrote after he was paralyzed. He wrote and he wrote and he wrote. And both of them, Rosenzweig was paralyzed. The only way he was able to communicate and write was through his eye movements, and his wife, Edith, assisted him with a special board that they created, and that she would track his eye movements so that he could spell out letters and words from this board. Rachamim Melamed actually uses a computer-based system, sort of like Stephen Hawking, if you've ever seen that, so that he was able to write and communicate. Rachamim Melamed passed away about 12 years ago. But even after his illness, Rachamim Melamed wrote a tremendous amount, maybe dozens of books, poems, novels, religious writings, in the midst of his sufferings. Rosenzweig was the same way. Rosenzweig wrote a tremendous amount after he was already fully paralyzed. And people would say in the encounter with Rosenzweig, and the same with Melamed, right, that you would see a person that looks like, I keep saying, that there's nothing left. And yet here there still remains this enormous vitality of life, right? That life is still present for them in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. And the way that life expresses itself is through language, right? That's what Rachamim Melamed, that's what Rosenzweig did, right? The ability to still hold on to language and to find language, a vehicle which could convey meaning for themselves and to others. Again, what makes language so important is not just that it conveys meaning. Language for somebody in that condition, it is the bridge between them and others. To have a disease that eventually takes everything away from you is to make it make you exist as if you cannot be in relationship with anybody in the world, right? You are fundamentally alienated and isolated. The only thing that enables there to be a bridge between you and everything you have lost and any other human being is language. And the fact that that was still there for them, that it remains, is truly profound. He says he can continue to create meaningful things for himself and for the world. Therefore, it is completely clear to him, despite his physical limitations, that there is an inner value in his life and that this is the core of his faith. This means that even in the most extreme situation, he did not lose the deep and fundamental point of his existence. And part of what made Rachamim Melamed very important was that he gave a lot of hope for other people dealing with profound illnesses and suffering, because they could see somebody who was able to show that something remains when everything has been taken away. And as I keep saying, that's what suffering does. It takes everything away. He says the human aspiration to reach certainty about life and its value is wrong. This is Rav Shagar speaking, right? That we want a sort of fixed sensibility that the world is stable, that the ground under our feet is stable, that the way things are today is the way they'll be tomorrow. But Rav Shagar knows there's a dimension of uncertainty to life that we must know how to accept. The reality of suffering is such that we know that even if everything is good today, tomorrow it could all fall apart. I speak about this as somebody who's experienced trauma and suffering in my own life and profound loss in my own life. My wife went through a very, very tragic and difficult pregnancy. She was pregnant with identical twin boys who were diagnosed in utero with a particular condition, who went through a series of procedures while she was still pregnant with them. We thought it was going to hopefully hold. She ended up delivering them premature, and they passed away a couple of hours after they were born. And one of the things that we had to internalize from that experience, and it's part of our own traumas that we're grappling with, is that every time we go to the doctor's office, especially about one of our children, we know that there's like a moment in which we might come back, or the doctor might come back and be like, there's a problem. Because once you've had that experience once, you know that it can and maybe very well will happen again. And it means that you can no longer look at life as stable, as certain. And that is very, very, very hard, especially about the people and the things that we love. He says the thought of the religious person that he will be fine if he observes the Torah and mitzvot that he is ensured is not correct. Again, this is the mentality that we all have. Religious and even not religious. We think everything is going to be okay because we think we're doing everything right? Not even some egotistical or narcissistic sense. We just think, okay, we're making good choices with our lives, right? Bad things don't happen to people who are doing things right. That's the way every human being looks at the world, but there's something fundamentally misaligned with that, with the way reality actually is. He says the very pursuit of certainty is already wrong. It stems from man's desire to control his life and himself, and it is not a position of faith. Therefore, what is right is to ask only about the concreteness of my life, here and now. Now what the future holds for me, not what the future holds for me, but whether there is value in what I'm doing today. The person must ask, is there something in his life that even if it does not save him from death, he still wants to continue to hold on to it? And this is the profound point Rav Shagar is making, as I keep saying, when everything is taken away, there's something that remains. And this is what makes suffering, again, both, meaningless, but also a gift, because what you discover when suffering takes everything away is that which you're willing to not die for, but live for, right? That which you're willing to say, this is why it's worthwhile to live. And anything you're willing to say, this is why it's worthwhile to live, just has to be, what is truly holy and truly divine. And it takes us a lot to be able to reach that point and to have that awareness and that kind of faith. That's something that suffering makes possible for better and for worse. I spoke about last week about and the week before that about the idea of covenants, about those things that we are bound to and can't escape, right? The things that we love and therefore we keep returning to because we feel drawn to them inexorably. And I also spoke about the way that we find our sort of covenants or relationships through language, that we use language to make sense of the world. We as religious Jews use religious language to infuse meaning in the world, and we can't escape the language that structures our world. Right? Words like Shabbat, Tefillah, Kedusha, right? These are things, Siddur, right? These are things, symbols, words that fundamentally impose themselves on the world, and the meaning that they hold for us is something that we cannot easily escape. And what suffering reveals is that even after the collapse, even after everything's been taken away, what remains is that which you are bound to, that you know that you're bound to, and that which, again, fundamentally infuses your life with a sense of meaning. The things that you are willing to live for when everything that has been taken away is exactly those things you're also, willing to die for. But what makes the Jewish people special in their history is that more than God wants us to die for God's Torah, God wants us to live. But sometimes living for God's Torah It means living again to the end, in which you recognize that this is what matters, and this is what you're willing to basically give everything for. I want to look at one more text before maybe opening up to some questions. This is not a text of Rav Shagar, but again, it captures, for me at least, this notion of how, at the end of the day, when everything is taken away, when suffering imposes itself on us, there's always one thing that remains. And in many ways, it's the most Jewish thing that remains. This Hasidic story told by Gershom Shalom. He uses it at the end of Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, which is one of his famous works about the history of Kabbalah and Chassidut. And here's what he says. He says, when the Baal Shem Tov had a difficult task before him, he would go to a certain place in the woods, light a fire, and meditate in prayer. And what he had set out to perform was done. Right? When the Baal Shem Tov had a problem, he'd go to the woods and he would light a fire and offer some, Kabbalistic prayers and achieve some great and holy and special things through that. When a generation later, the Maggid of Mezrich was faced with the same task, he would go to the same place in the woods and say, we can no longer light the fire, but we can still speak the prayers. And what he wanted became a reality. So the Maggid of Mezrich was not as great a rabbi as the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov was his teacher. Maggid of Mezrich can't do the things the Baal Shem Tov did. So the Maggid of Mezrich goes out to the woods. He can say the prayers, but he can't light the fire, right? There's something that is lost, right? There's what we say in Hebrew, Yeridat HaDorot. There's sort of a descent. Each from the Baal Shem Tov to the Maggid, something is lost, but there's still that which remains. And then we're told there's another generation. Again, a generation later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov had to perform this task. Once again, right? Every great rabbi in their generation is going to approach a moment of crisis in which they have to rise up and do what they can. And in this Hasidic metaphor, it means going to the woods and offering these prayers. So Rabbi Moshe of Sasov goes, it's his moment. He goes to the woods and he said, we can't light the fire anymore. Only the Baal Shem Tov could do that. Nor do we know the secret meditations belong to the prayer. The Maggid did, but I don't. But we do know the place in the woods to which all this belongs, and that must be sufficient, and sufficient it was. So at least the Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, even if he couldn't light the fire, if he didn't know the Kabbalistic kavanot, right, he could still go to the place in the woods. But now we go to the fourth generation. When another generation had passed, and remember Yisrael of Rizhin was called upon to perform the task, he sat down on his gold chair in his castle. The Rizhiner Rebbe is famous for his wealth and opulence. So that's why it says he has a gold chair in a castle. And here's what he said. He said, we cannot light the fire. We cannot speak the prayers. And we don't know the place. We can't go to that place in the woods. But we can tell the story of how it was done. And the storyteller adds, the story he told had the same effect as the actions of the other three, right? When we get to the fourth generation, right, there's been loss after loss after loss after loss until we get to the Rizhiner, there's basically nothing left. Can't light the fire, don't know the prayers. We don't even know the place to go anymore. But what we can do, there's something that still remains. What remains are the words. We can at least talk about it. We still have language. And if, again, there's anything that Jews know how to do, is that in the wake of trauma, we still find a way to speak. Not always, not for everyone. As we said, for some survivors, that was simply an impossibility. But what Jews know, what Jews discover every time they take suffering to its endpoint, when everything is taken away, is that language remains, right? Because the Torah remains, right? Like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? Yavne v'chochmeha, right? In a world in which you lose everything, you have to at least have the Torah, because you can at least still have the Torah, right? Rabbi Hananya ben Trajon, you can destroy the Jewish body, you can destroy the physical manifestation of the Torah, but the letters remain. And as Gershom Shalom pointed out here, the story remains. That's what we do. We tell stories about things that are no longer with us. But in the effect of telling the story, we don't experience loss, right? In reading this, there's some sense of things aren't the way that we want them to be. But as he ends here, right, the story had the same effect as the actions of the other three. There's something about the power of words that is able to fill in everything else that is not there, right? We know this, right? If you've lost a loved one, it doesn't mean that they're not still present with us. You can still talk to them. You can still call their name and you can still speak to them, because that's what language just allows us to do. Language just allows us that when things are taken away, to speak the name, to invoke the words, and to make them present again. And if there's one like lesson that Jews have learned about suffering, it is at least that there's always something that remains. And for the Jewish people, it has always been at the very least that Torah remains, the language of Torah remains. And that is what we hold on to, because that is ultimately where we find the strength to live, even in the face of death. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to open up. We got a few minutes if anybody has any questions or comments.
Just a comment. There's a lot of research that's done on trauma recently.
Yes.
Both, but I actually just took a course at Harvard on the use of psychedelics, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy for trauma, and I believe that sort of what you're saying, in many ways, there are many different avenues that can open up when the language is lost, and that's one way. And Bessel van der Kolk, or all the people who do sensory motor kind of work on trauma is very, very important, but I don't want to get into that. I was learning a Tanchuma today on the Shvirat Haluchot, and the Tanchuma says that when Moshe came down and he saw the Otiot Porchot
Ba'avir, yeah.
Ba'avir, and so then he broke it. So in other words, if that loss of language at that trauma of what happened, and that's where we say Yashikoach Shibarta to a certain extent, that he broke it, and then he afterwards was Charut al Luchot again in a different way and found a different language. So I think there are many different ways of creating language, not just with psychedelics and not just with trauma work, the body keeps the score. Bessel van der Kolk's
that's this famous thing. Look, I want to get at that from a different angle. I love to write. I love poetry. I love learning Torah. So for me, the language is always a very heavy, dimension of this. But let's go back to the Klausenberger Rebbe, right? The mitzvot in their sort of bare essence, to not eat chametz on Pesach is not a linguistic construction in the way that we think about it. But the most basic form of language is our actions, right? Like if we want to use sort of a philosophical language, right? There's de Saussure's philosophy of language, famous structural linguist of the early 20th century, is the signifier and the signified, right? The signifier is the phoneme. It's like the word that we use, and the signified is the meaning that we associate with it, right? And we mostly think about language in terms of the signified, the meaning. That's why we're talking, is we're communicating meaning. But one of the things that philosophy in the 20th century starts to realize is that the signified actually means a lot. Sorry, the signifier, right? The bare word actually in some ways is more important than the meaning, right? And as Jews, we intuitively get that because the Torah is fundamentally much more about the signifier than the signified. Because the meaning of Torah is always open to interpretation, that means what we look at when we look at the Torah are signifiers, right? Words, but the meaning is not fully there or transparent or with us, right? And actions function in the same way. Actions are more signifiers than words, because when we hear words, we already intuitively associate meanings with them. But when somebody acts, right, we know it means something, but we're not always sure exactly what it means. That's why we say actions speak louder than words, because there's something about an action that conveys meaning in a way that words can't. And that goes to what you were saying, is that we communicate not just with language, right? The act of mitzvot for the Klausenberger, right, in itself communicated meaning far more profoundly than any words he could have put forth, right? So I think that's something else that is important to keep in mind here, that we talk about. I keep talking about language, but what I'm really talking about are the fundamental building blocks of meaning in our lives. And those things always exceed language. That which is most meaningful to us cannot fully be captured in language. Otherwise, we would just be able to say it exhausts its meaning. It defines itself. It's the things that can't be fully defined that are ultimately that which keep providing meaning for us and that keep pushing us forward. And so much of the work of suffering is to finding those signifiers that mean more than we can ever say, even in the midst of everything that is lost from us. And it's an unfortunate, as Rosenzweig said, gift is such a challenging word. But there is something to be learned when everything is taken away, because you gain a full appreciation for those things that are truly sublime and transcendent and can never be fully put into words. that hold meaning in ways that we can't ever fully understand. And again, it's not that nobody embraces suffering, like looking for those things, but sometimes we were able to recognize that that can be present, and that again, what language does also teach us is that things that are taken away are never gone forever, right? That is what language offers us. Daniel, I see you got a hand raised.
Yeah, I find that all of that very true and meaningful. I'm wondering if you could speak quickly on the topic of bitachon, in a world where, you can't rely on reality, right?
Right. Right. So it's a really good question, and one that actually Rav Shagar spends a lot of time thinking about. I can't answer it on one foot. What we are going to talk about in 2 sessions is Rav Shagar's approach to redemption. And I think that will get at how do we look at the world knowing that it can be swallowed up at any time, right? And redemption is exactly our belief in the fact that the world can't or won't be swallowed up forever, right? And so that's to me, that's the best way to get at it. And we're seeing some of the seeds of it here, because if there are things that always exist, even in the face of loss, that even when everything is taken away, something remains, then that in a certain sense becomes our sense of bitachon, right? That nothing, there's no loss that is ever total and forever, right? If there's always something that remains. And the chiddush of the Jewish people is we are that which remains when everything is taken away. This is a point that Rosenzweig makes, and I know Rav Shagar would agree as well. We ourselves, our living existence, are proof of the fact that when everything is taken away, something remains. And that our mere existence is itself testifies to the impossibility of faith and God, and to a large extent after everything. So there's something that I take, great consolation in that. But again, when we get to redemption, hopefully it'll give a better sense of how one could look forward to the future in a way that is meaningful and positive, given, as we've said, that things are so uncertain and unsteady. I live in Israel right now. It feels like this place is crumbling before my eyes. It's a very difficult thing. But one of the things I keep reminding myself is, again, that there's always, that which remains. And the question is, how do we identify that which is worth, again, living for, in the sense that we're willing to push ourselves, even in the face of the impossible, to live for them because they are of ultimate value. And if there's bitachon, it's the bitachon of knowing that those things are real and true no matter what, right? For the Klausenberger, Torah and mitzvot were something that the Nazis couldn't take away. Meaning at that moment, he had absolute bitachon in what they meant to him and why they were worth living for and possibly dying for. So for me, that's the best I can offer on one foot for how we rethink bitachon. It's not going to be a bitachon of, well, if I have faith and everything, don't worry. It's good. My story, my kid's story, the story of those I love is just going to have a happy ending. That ends with the Holocaust. It ends with anybody who takes suffering, the profound problem of suffering, seriously.
I think Viktor Frankl in some ways says the same thing about that space between the thought and then what you choose to do. There's a very fine book also by Eva Eggers called The Choice, where she survived Auschwitz as well. And her basis in treating people with trauma was that sense, and it's a major theme in doing trauma work, is that sense of taking agency and using language. And I think that's what the psychedelics do. They allow the narrative to come out when it's totally blocked.
Right. They allow people to find meaning, essentially, right? That's what allows them to do. And again, I'm not against psychedelics. I understand they've been helpful to people, but I also think if Jews or anything are masters at attempting to find how meaning exceeds our rational capacity without the use of drugs. That's all. Our attachment to Torah and mitzvot is such that Torah is our drug. I mean that seriously. There's a pasuk that I was recently writing an article about Rav Shagar and trauma, and there's a pasuk I just found. Only recently, I never knew this pasuk existed. Sometimes you find Torah and it's mamish, a revelation that you're discovering it for the for the first time, even though it's been there forever. So here's the here. I want to just read this here, and then we'll end with that. I'll just read you the verse from Tehillim, and I was so upset that I had never seen this before. He says, here's the verse. 1 second. The verse is, were your Torah not my delight, I would have perished in my misery. If your Torah was not my delight, I would have perished in my misery. And I think that gets to something very, very profound about how Jews relate to, again, our connection to God and connection to what ultimately matters, even when everything has been taken away from us.
Is that where is that?
I'll tell you, it's 1 second.
Is that 119?
It is. Yeah, it's one Kufiyat Tet Sadi Bet, 90 verse 92.
Yeah.
Very,
So
very powerful.
Yes. So Torah is our mushroom.
So I don't like that. I struggle with that. Like, let's put it that way. I don't want to negate the value of psychedelics for people, but I also want to note that there's something about this that doesn't. Again, there's something about the nature of the way in which meaning is both hidden and then revealed, irrational, yet still like it fills our lives with meaning without having to. Drugs do all of that too, but I'm saying we don't necessarily only need drugs to be able to recognize how that plays a role in our lives.
Of course not. Of course not.
Right. No, I'm not saying you are. There has been a big push in psychedelics. I've seen this recently, and I struggle because, like I said, like I just feel like it can overshadow some of our own ways of thinking that we have to, still work through. But if it helps people, believe me, I'm all for that, which helps people. And I think that's what, and it's always paired with other things. It's never like just coming on its own. Let's look to, unless there's any other questions, we'll look to end here. And we will pick up next time. We're going to move a little bit away from faith. We're going to move a little bit away from God towards the other. We're going to look at how Rav Shagar, looking at how Rav Shagar conceives of ethics and our responsibility to the other. I'll preface it by saying that Rav Shagar takes a somewhat Levinasian, view towards ethics and the way that we're bound to others, the challenge, the difficulty of enabling ourselves to be responsible to others. And so we'll do that next week. Then we're going to focus on Rav Shagar and Tefillah, and then our last session will be on how Rav Shagar conceives our orientation towards redemption. So thank you, everyone. Unless any other comments or questions, otherwise, wish everybody a good Shabbos.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Trubov, and thank you to all the participants. Just a quick announcement that our pre-Purim program will be this Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern, featuring Rabbi David and Rabbi Dr. Samuel Liebens, looking into questions pertaining to what it means to live in a world with an invisible God. So you can register for this class and any other classes on our website, drisha.org. Thank you so much. Lehitraot. Thanks.